At 62 years old, Odessa Marsh stood at the edge of ruin with nothing left to her name but a tin box of coins and clothes on her back. Her late husband's cousin, a hard-eyed man named Thaddeus Culp, who had inherited the family's modest holdings after her husband's death, had turned her out of farmhouse she'd called home for 30 years, declaring that a widow with no sons had no claim to land in his eyes. What she had left was $11.40, counted twice with trembling fingers, and a stubborn refusal to beg. So when she heard that the old grist mill on Coldwater Creek, flooded and forgotten for a decade, was going for a mere $9 at auction because no one else wanted the cursed, waterlogged wreck, she stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it. The townsfolk laughed. They said she'd bought herself a swamp. They didn't know that beneath the silted floorboards and rotted grinding stones lay something sealed away long before the flood ever came. Something that would still the whole valley's tongue and put right a wrong that had festered for a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Marsh. If you have ever been counted out by people who should have known your worth, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Odessa had been born Odessa Fenwick in 1841, in a cabin at the foot of the Blue Ridge foothills in Virginia County, so small it barely earned a name on the state maps. And she had grown up the daughter of a miller. Her father, Jeremiah Fenwick, had run a modest grist mill on a creek not so different from the one that would, decades later, hold her fate inside its flooded walls. It was there, among the dust of ground corn and the endless turning of the great wheel, that Odessa learned the two things that would carry her through every hardship still to come: patience and the particular kind of attention that lets a person see value where others see only wreckage. Her father used to say that a mill was a language if you knew how to listen to it. The groan of the shaft when a bearing needed grease, the pitch of the water striking the paddles when the flow had changed, the smell of scorched grain, that meant the stones were running too close together. He taught her to read those signs before she was 10 years old, guiding her small hands over the cold iron of the gears, explaining that a mill, properly tended, would feed a whole community, and a mill neglected would starve it just as surely. Her mother, Ruth, was a quieter presence but no less formative, a woman who had come from Pennsylvania Dutch stock and who believed fiercely in thrift, in mending before discarding, in the notion that waste was a kind of sin against Providence. It was from her mother that Odessa learned to sew a garment 3 times over before giving up on it, to can vegetables against the winter, to stretch a single ham through a month of suppers. These were not glamorous skills, and in her girlhood Odessa sometimes resented the endless labor of it, the years without a new dress, without idle hours. But she came to understand, especially later, that her mother's frugality was not poverty of spirit, but a kind of quiet mastery. The mastery of a woman who refused to let circumstance dictate her dignity. She married young at 19 to a gentle, soft-spoken man named Odessa Marsh, a carpenter's son with sawdust perpetually in the creases of his hands and a habit of humming Oldhams under his breath while he worked. Elias did not come from money, but he came from a family with land, a modest farm near a town called Hollow Bend, tucked into a valley in what would later become West Virginia, a place of steep green hills and a wide, slow-moving creek that the locals called Coldwater for the way it ran icy even in July, fed as it was by mountain springs. Odessa and Elias built a life there together, quiet and unremarkable in a way that good lives often are. Children born, and in 2 heartbreaking instances, lost the fever before their first birthdays. A garden Odessa kept meticulously, a marriage sustained by small kindnesses rather than grand gestures. Elias worked timber and carpentry, and Odessa kept house, tended what animals they had, and occasionally still found herself drawn down to the old Hollow Bend grist mill on the creek, with a miller of that generation, a taciturn man named Solomon Webb, would let her watch the wheel turn, and something in her would settle, remembering her father, remembering particular music of water striking wood. It was in those years that she first heard whispers about the mill's older history, for the mill she watched turn was not the original structure. The first mill on that site, an older, cruder building erected sometime in the 1820s by one of the valley's founding families, had burned in a fire whose cause was never quite settled, and the replacement had been built a little downstream, close to the bend in the creek, on land that had once belonged to a free black family named the Praters, who had, according to the older residents, vanished from the valley sometime before Odessa's own arrival, their departure wrapped in a silence that, Nobody in Hollow Bend seemed eager to break. Odessa noted this the way she noted everything. Filed away, unremarked, the sort of loose thread a patient mind keeps without knowing yet why. Elias and Odessa's marriage endured 26 years. Through the war that split the region's loyalties down the middle and left Hollow Bend scarred but standing. Through hard winters and harder harvests, until Elias died in 1884 of a lung ailment that took him slowly enough that Odessa had time to grieve him twice. Once a man he had been, and once a man the illness left behind. He left with a farmhouse and a small parcel of land, but he had, in his failing years, borrowed against both from his cousin Thaddeus Culp, a man Odessa had never trusted, whose smile always arrived a half-second before his eyes agreed to it. Elias had meant to pay the debt back with the sale of a timber stand. He had not lived long enough to do it. For 6 years after Elias's death, Odessa managed. She was frugal in the way her mother had taught her. She took in mending and sold preserves at the county market, and she kept the farmhouse standing through sheer force of will. But Thaddeus Culp had been waiting. Patient as a man who knows the law is on his side, even when decency is not. In the spring of 1890, with the debt still unpaid and interest compounding in the particular cruel arithmetic of men who enjoy compounding it, he moved to claim the farmhouse and land as his own, citing the note Elias had signed years before. The county judge, a weary man named Harlan Pierce, who had seen 100 such cases and would see 100 more, found in Thaddeus's favor, not because he believed it was just, but because the paper said what the paper said, and paper, in that country in that year, spoke louder than a widow's grief. Odessa left the farmhouse she had lived in for 3 decades with 2 trunks, her mother's quilt, her father's old pocket level that she had kept as a keepsake of the mill, and $11.40 that she had managed to hide from Thaddeus's accounting, coin by coin, in the lining of a coat. She took a room above the dry goods store in Hollow Bend proper, run by a widow named Constance Hale, who charged her almost nothing and asked almost nothing in return, and there Odessa sat for 3 weeks in the gray business of grief and calculation, trying to determine what a woman of 62, alone, with $11, could possibly do to build a life from nothing. It was Constance who first mentioned the old grist mill down on Coldwater Creek, not the mill Odessa remembered from her married years, which had itself fallen into disrepair after old Solomon Webb's death and had been replaced by a newer steam-powered operation nearer the rail line, but the original stone-end timber structure built downstream near the old Prater land, the one that had operated fitfully through the 70s and 80s under a series of indifferent owners before a spring. Flood in 1887 breached its foundation and filled its lower floor with silt and standing water, and which has sat abandoned and half-drowned ever since. The county was auctioning it that very month, Constance said, along with its small parcel of land, because the last owner had died without heirs and the taxes had gone unpaid for 3 years running. Nobody wanted it. It was a flooded ruin, its stones cracked, its wheel rotted, sitting in a hollow that flooded again every spring, valuable for nothing but the timber that could be salvaged from its bones. Odessa went to the auction anyway, on a gray Tuesday morning in April, standing at the back of the small crowd gathered in front of the county courthouse, and when the auctioneer called the mill property and asked for an opening bid, there was a long, telling silence, punctuated by low laughter from a cluster of men near the front, among them Thaddeus Culp himself, who had come, Odessa suspected, simply to see her humiliated by association, a widow so desperate she'd bid on land the whole, Valley considered worthless. When the silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement, Odessa heard her own voice, thin but steady, call out $9, nearly all she had in the world, and the auctioneer, startled, looked for a counterbid that never came, and brought his gavel down with particular indifference at a man selling off a worthless thing to a woman he assumed was worth even less. Thaddeus laughed loud enough that she heard it across the square, and called out that she bought herself a swamp and a headache, and several men joined him, and Odessa, walking back toward the dry goods store with the deed folded into her coat pocket and $1.40 remaining to her name, let them laugh, because she had learned long ago from her father that people mock what they haven't taken the time to understand. She walked out to the mill the following morning, alone, following the old cart track along Coldwater Creek until the trees opened onto the hollow where the structure stood, and the sight of it struck her harder than she expected. Not because it was so ruined, but because some part of her, some old, unkillable part shaped by her father's hands on the gears of another mill decades before, looked at the sagging roof line and the water-stained stone, and did not see a swamp. She saw bones. She saw a building that had been built to last, its foundation stones cut and fitted by someone who had cared, its heavy timber frame still largely sound above the flood line even after a decade of neglect. The lower floor was indeed filled with several feet of standing water and silt, black and stagnant, and the smell of rot hung thick in the hollow air. But the upper floor, where the grinding stones and a hopper had once stood, was dry, and it was there, on her first full day of ownership, poking through debris with a borrowed lantern and her father's old level tucked into her apron pocket for luck, that Odessa found the first clue, that the mill held more than anyone imagined. Behind the great millstone, which had been left in place because it was too heavy for any prior scavenger to bother moving, she noticed that the stone wall of the structure, the original wall, older than the timber frame around it, clearly a remnant of the first mill that stood on this exact spot before burning decades earlier and being rebuilt upon, bore a section that did not quite match the mortar work around it, a rectangle perhaps 2 feet by 3, set with a slightly different hand. The joints just a shade too clean, too deliberate for ordinary repair work. She might have dismissed it as nothing, the eccentricity of some long-dead mason, except that her father's training rose up in her unbidden, the old instinct to listen to what a structure was trying to tell her, and she found herself running her palm across that patch of wall the way she might run a hand along an aching horse's flank, feeling for the wrongness. There was a hollowness to it when she rapped her knuckles against the stone, a sound different from the solid thunk of the wall around it, and Odessa Marsh, 62 years old, alone in a flooded ruin that the whole valley had laughed at her for buying, felt her heart begin to beat harder in a way it had not in years. It took her the better part of a week, working in stolen hours when her hands ached and her back protested every movement, prying at the mortar with a chisel she'd borrowed from Constance Hale's late husband's toolbox before the stone finally gave way, and behind it she found not treasure in the way the word is usually meant, but something that would prove, in the end, far more valuable, a metal strongbox, rusted but intact, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, and beside it, wedged into the cavity and protected from the damp by the same oilcloth wrapping, a bundle of papers that made her hands shake so badly she had to sit down on the cold stone floor before she could bring herself to unwrap them. The papers, when she finally spread them by lantern light, proved to be a set of documents belonging to a man named Josiah Prater, dated between 1819 and 1834, and among them was a hand-drawn plat map of the valley showing a much larger parcel of land than Odessa had ever heard attributed to the Prater family. Land that included not only the mill site itself, but a long, fertile stretch running nearly to the base of the eastern ridge, along with a bill of sale showing that Josiah Prater, a free black man, had purchased that land outright in 1819 from the estate of a Colonel Ambrose Whitfield, one of the valley's original settlers, for a sum that, adjusted for the era, represented a small fortune earned, according to a letter tucked among the papers, through Josiah's skill as a millwright and his ownership of the very first grist mill on that creek, the one that had officially burned to the ground in 1834 under circumstances that had never been fully explained. The letter itself, written in a careful, educated hand and addressed to Josiah's brother in Ohio, told a story that made Odessa's chest tight with a grief that was not her own and yet felt urgently, personally hers to carry. Josiah wrote that certain men in the valley, led by a man he named only as W., had grown resentful of a black family's prosperity and landholding in a county where such things were increasingly unwelcome as sectional tensions hardened in the years before the war, and that threats had been made against him and his family, and that he feared for their safety, and that he intended to hide his deed and his plat map inside the walls of his own mill, a building he trusted, having built it himself, with his own hands, so that no fire, no theft, no forced signature under duress could erase the legal truth of what he owned, in the hope that someday, somehow, the truth could be recovered and the land restored to his descendants, wherever the family's road might carry them. The mill had burned within the year of that letter's date. The official record, which Odessa would later find in the county archive, listed the fire as an accident, the Prater family as having removed from the county shortly after, and the land as having reverted through a series of transactions so tangled and so conveniently documented that they could only have been arranged in advance, into the hands of a consortium of local men that included, Odessa discovered with a chill she would carry the rest of her life, an ancestor of Thaddeus Culp himself. The deepening of the mystery consumed Odessa for weeks. She traveled, on foot and by borrowed wagon, to the county courthouse in the seat town, poring over land records with the help of a sympathetic young clerk named Nathaniel Boyd, who found her research more interesting than his usual duties, and who helped her trace the chain of title on the larger Prater parcel through 6 decades of transfers, sales, and one deeply suspicious gift from the Culp family to a church that no longer existed and had apparently never held services. She wrote, with Nathaniel's help, to the address in Ohio mentioned in Josiah's letter, not truly expecting an answer after so many decades, and was astonished 3 months later to receive a reply, not from Josiah's brother, long dead, but from a great-granddaughter named Clara Prater Dunmore, a schoolteacher in Columbus who had grown up on family stories of a vanished Virginia homestead and a mill that had burned under suspicious circumstances. Stories she had always assumed were embellished by grief and time, until Odessa's letter arrived with the plat map's description matching, detail for detail, the land her own grandmother had spoken of on her deathbed. The conflict Odessa had perhaps always known was coming arrived within days of the valley learning what she had found, because in a place as small as Hollow Bend, no secret survives its own telling. Thaddeus Culp arrived at the mill in person, red-faced and furious in a way Odessa had never seen him, insisting the documents were forgeries, that Odessa had planted them herself in some elaborate scheme to embarrass his family and extort money. And when that argument failed to move her, he tried another tack entirely, offering to buy the mill and its parcel back from her for $50, a sum meant to seem generous to a woman he still believed was destitute and desperate, not understanding that Odessa no longer needed his money nearly so much as she needed the truth to survive contact with daylight. The town itself split along uncomfortable lines. Some, like Constance Hale and the young clerk Nathaniel Boyd, rallied to Odessa's side, understanding instinctively that a wrong long buried does not stop being a wrong simply because it is old. Others, more numerous, worried aloud about what it would mean for a dozen families whose land, purchased decades ago from the Culp consortium in good faith, might suddenly be entangled in legal claims none of them had asked for, and Odessa found herself, in the town's general store and church socials, the object of suspicion nearly as sharp as a mockery that had greeted her purchase of the mill in the first place. Judge Harlan Pierce, the same weary man who had ruled against her in the matter of her farmhouse, was petitioned by Thaddeus to have the documents seized and examined by a court-appointed expert, a request Odessa did not fight, because she had nothing to fear from scrutiny and everything to gain from it. She understood, with the patience her mother had taught her, that the truth, properly examined, does not need defending so much as it needs only the chance to be seen clearly. The examination, conducted over painstaking weeks by a document specialist brought in from Richmond, confirmed what Odessa already knew in her bones. The ink, the paper, the handwriting, all consistent with the stated dates. The bill of sale bearing the authenticated seal of the county clerk's office as it had existed in 1819, utterly unforgeable by any means available to a widow of modest means in 1890. Faced with evidence he could no longer dismiss, and with Clara Prater Dunmore herself now corresponding directly with the court through a Columbus attorney, Thaddeus Culp's bluster finally broke, and in a courtroom crowded with more Hollow Bend citizens than had attended a single session in a decade, the truth of the Prater land claim and the fraudulent transfers that followed the mysterious fire of 1834 was formally entered into the county record. Odessa did not seek to enrich herself from any of it, and this, more than anything else, was what finally silenced the valley's wagging tongues and turned mockery into something closer to reverence. She could have claimed squatters' rights or finder's compensation on the mill parcel and walked away considerably richer than the $9 she'd paid for it. Instead, working with Nathaniel Boyd and, eventually, with Clara Prater Dunmore herself, who traveled to Hollow Bend for the first time in her life to stand on the land her great-grandfather had built with his own hands, Odessa helped orchestrate a restoration. The larger Prater parcel, still held in various hands under the tainted original transfers, was returned through a negotiated settlement to the Prater descendants, with the families currently living on portions that allowed to remain as tenants or purchased their homesteads outright at fair value from the restored Prater estate, a solution that cost the ordinary families of Hollow Bend nothing, and cost only Thaddeus Culp and his fellow conspirators heirs the ill-gotten gains they had never truly been entitled to. Odessa herself kept only the flooded mill and its small immediate parcel, which she and Claire agreed was rightly hers now by the strange justice of 9 honest dollars and a decade of nobody else wanting it. And with the help of the newly formed Odessa Marsh Trust, funded by a portion of the settlement, the mill was drained, repaired, and rebuilt as a working structure once more, its great wheel turning again on Coldwater Creek for the first time in years, grinding grain for a valley that had very nearly let its own history drown. Thaddeus Culp faced no prison sentence, for the men who had truly conspired against Josiah Prater were 60 years dead, but he faced something perhaps more fitting. He watched from the same square where he had once laughed at Odessa's foolishness, as she was thanked publicly by name, as Clara Prater Dunmore stood beside her and called her friend, as the mill he had mocked her for buying became, within a year, the most visited and most respected piece of property in the whole valley, and he lived out his remaining years in the diminished, quieted way of a man who has been correctly understood by his neighbors at last. And so we return to where we began, to a woman of 62 standing at the edge of ruin with $11 and a stubborn refusal to beg, a widow cast out by a man who mistook paper claims for justice, who was mocked for spending nearly everything she had on a flooded, forgotten mill that the whole valley considered worthless. What Odessa Marsh understood, and what her story asks us to remember, is that value does not announce itself loudly, and worth does not always look like worth at first glance. Sometimes it looks like a rotted wheel in standing water, and a wall that sounds just slightly hollow if you know to listen for it. She did not set out to become the valley's conscience or its quiet historian. She set out only to survive with her dignity intact, using the patient, listening attention her father had taught her at another mill, decades before, in another life. But in refusing to look away from a small wrongness in a stone wall, she gave back to a family what had been stolen from them across 2 generations. And she gave back to her valley something it had lost without even knowing it was missing, the plain truth of its own past. The mill turns still today on Coldwater Creek, and those who visit are told by the families who live there now that its stones remember more than most buildings ever do, and that the woman who bought it for $9 understood, better than anyone who mocked her, exactly what she was buying. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Odessa's story. If it moved you, we would be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet patience can outlast even the loudest mockery, and that it is never too late to set an old wrong right. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life where you found real value in something the world had already written off? We read every one of your reflections, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close,